Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the astrological forecast for July of 2024. Joining me today is astrologer Austin Coppock. Hey, Austin.
Hey Chris, how's it going?
Thank you for joining me once again. So, in the first half of this episode, for the first hour, we're going to talk about news stories connected with astrology that have happened over the past month since our last forecast episode. Then, in the second hour of the forecast, we're going to get into the actual deep dive of the astrology of July 2024. So, for those that want to jump ahead to the forecast, there's going to be timestamps either below the video on YouTube or on the Astrology Podcast website in the entry for this episode, so you can jump forward. All right, so let's first do a very quick overview or preview of the astrology of July before we jump into the news. So here is the planetary alignments calendar for July that shows the basic planetary alignments. So at the very beginning of the month, we're coming off of Saturn having just stationed retrograde in the sign of Pisces on the 29th of June. And then just 2 days into July, the planet Neptune also stations retrograde on July 2nd in Pisces. And Saturn and Neptune are within 10 degrees of a conjunction of each other. So that's going to be the dominant energy at the very beginning of July is going to be the Saturn Neptune conjunction. So also on July 2nd, the planet Mercury ingresses into the sign of Leo. Then a few days later, we get our first lunation of the month, which is a new moon in the sign of Cancer on the 5th. The following week, Venus ingresses into the sign of Leo on July 11th. Then our main aspect of the month is the Mars-Uranus conjunction, which takes place on July 15th, which looks kind of volatile in the sign of Taurus. Then on the 20th, Mars departs from Taurus and moves into the sign of Gemini. Uh, the day after that, there's a full moon in Capricorn on July 21st. Then the following day, the sun departs from Cancer and moves into Leo. So we get the beginning of Leo season for 1 month. A few days later, Mercury moves into Virgo, and Mercury is actually going to start slowing down and preparing to station retrograde, which it will eventually do in the first week of August. But the later part of July is sort of the ramp up to that as Mercury starts slowing down in the sign of Virgo, and it forms a wide square with the planet Mars, which is still in early Gemini at that point. So that's some of the astrology that we're going to be talking about later in this episode. But yeah, first let's talk about news and events. So hey, Austin, how's it going?
It's going pretty good, Chris. How are you?
Very good. You're looking conspicuously smarter and more sharp for some reason that I can't put my finger on, but I feel like yeah, you're looking good with the new glasses.
Thank you. Yeah, I've been, I don't know, three-quarters blind for quite some time. My left eye is full legal blindness, and my right eye was trying so hard to compensate
Yeah,
for years and years.
that's an interesting thing is that happens sometimes with the luminaries in terms of if there's like issues with sight, and sometimes the luminaries like literally indicating a person's sight.
Yeah, so I was legally blind by the end of my teens, but I got eye surgery when I was in my early 20s, and both sun and moon are afflicted for me. Neither one is in good shape, and so both eyes were pretty garbage. But what's interesting is the eye surgery didn't take equally. My right eye corrected to 20/20, and then my left eye got to roughly 20/80, which is still four times worse than perfect, but was five times better than what it was. And the time, because it's been more than 20 years since I had the surgery, my right eye has stayed pretty good, but the left basically lapsed all the way back to pre-surgery. And so it's interesting because with the chart, there's a matter of like what is the difficulty indicated if the planet, in this case the lights, are afflicted, but then there's are there mitigations, or are there mitigating factors like aspects to happy, powerful benefics, which often show the efficacy of remedies, right? And so my son, even though my son's in rough shape, has a trine and is ruled by an angular Jupiter in Cancer. right? So the right eye has taken remedies very well, whereas the moon doesn't have access to a happy benefic, and so has taken remedies less well.
Yeah, that's a super important astrology lesson that when you have a planet that's both afflicted and has positive aspects to it, you usually just get both, and you'll get like an issue that comes up, but then you'll also have it so that that issue can be remedied or fixed or offset so that you have the experience of something being taken away and something being given back.
Yeah, there are absolutely there are some delineation sections in Firmicus, where it's like Mars, Saturn, and then aspected by a waning moon, and under these conditions in this house, like you will die of hemorrhoids unless the benefic, Jupiter is in a tight trine, in which case a doctor will save you from dying of hemorrhoids. Right, like it's literally you're going to have this issue and then you'll die of it unless, right? Which is the hyperbolic, unnecessarily intense traditional style delineation, but that's it's the idea. So my
Yeah.
sun will not die of hemorrhoids, whereas my moon might.
Yeah, I saw somebody on Twitter today complaining about Mars transiting their sixth and getting bitten by like two different dogs during the course of that transit, which reminded me of some of Firmicus's like gruesome, like the native will be eaten alive by dogs delineations, which are pretty extreme. But it's funny how sometimes there's still echoes of like relevance in some of those ancient delineations.
Yeah, well, and so what's interesting is a lot of the you will die, like the violent death combinations, get a different set of death inflictors depending on the element that it's in. So it's like if it's in water sign, torn apart by fishes. If it's in an earth sign, run over by an ox, a humane sign, right, an air sign, come up and stab you. But like there are like elemental categories of how death arrives. So I don't remember exactly. I don't remember which element dogs herald as death inflictors, but
All right. Well, on that note, this is a much different opening for the death
really
by
setting the tone, huh?
Yeah, Death by Hemorrhoids is our opening for July. So let's do some review first. Let's talk about June. Some crazy stuff has happened with June. I want to do more of a concise sort of like overview of some of the major news stories than I usually do and just like run through them relatively briskly. So, um, the first early part of the month was really dominated by the Gemini stories that were surrounding, especially the Venus cazimi in Gemini, but also the Sun and Mercury were moving through there. And especially on June 5th, there was a whole stellium of five planets in Gemini when the moon caught up and moved through that sign as well. So the first set of stories is really dominated by that Gemini stellium in the first part of the month. Later in the month, it was really dominated from the second half of June forward by the Saturn Neptune conjunction, which finally got within 10 degrees of conjoining in Pisces. And then both of them are stationing retrograde in Pisces right now. So the first set of stories all happened around June 3rd, 4th, and 5th when all of those planets were in Gemini. The first one was, as we mentioned on the last episode, as was about to happen. We were anticipating Claudia Sheinbaum was elected president of Mexico on June 3rd, which was right on the Venus cazimi that just took place the following day on June 4th. So that was incredible, just as a continued demonstration where the indigenous astrology of Mesoamerica was very much based on the Venus cazimi cycles. And then you have this really interesting event of the first woman leader being elected president there at a conjunction of the Sun and Venus. So that happened on the cazimi. Then the following day, on June 5th, there was at least like four or five major news stories that all happened that I wrote down that were notable that were connected with that Venus cazimi. So one of them is that the Boeing Starliner spaceship finally launched after a delay on June 5th. So the first launch where we were looking at the electional chart in the last episode was actually aborted, and that was the one that had Virgo rising and Mercury conjunct Uranus, and there was some sort of electrical or technical glitch that caused them to scrub that launch and move it 2 days later, which is interesting because you had actually talked about how the electional chart would be way better if it was launched a few days later once Mercury went into Gemini. So that it actually ended
Yeah.
up working out. So,
That's
what ended up happening is they launched on the 5th, and that's when the moon was in Gemini. I actually have the chart for that. So it had some good things and bad things, though, that occurred as a result of the launch being delayed. On the one hand, they launched it when the moon had gone into Gemini, and so there were 5 planets in the sign of Gemini, and then you had this spaceship launch, which could mark a new era in terms of space travel or space tourism or shuttling people back and forth to the International Space Station, which is what the mission was. The only downside is because it was delayed by several days, the chart that they ended up using had Leo rising and the Sun and Venus at 15 degrees of Gemini separating from their conjunction at the cazimi, and both of them were applying closely to a square with Saturn at 18 degrees of Pisces. So it's like the ruler of the ascendant in the launch chart was applying to a square with Saturn. And what ended up happening is they have run into like a bunch of issues with some of the thrusters not working. And it was only supposed to be like a week-long trip to this International Space Station, but now it's been extended by multiple weeks. And there's a lot of drama now with them waiting to bring those 2 astronauts back to Earth, but trying to fix some technical issues before they do that to make sure it's safe. So there's been a lot of delays, which kind of fits the application to Saturn.
yeah, absolutely.
So one last
They should have stuck with the Virgo rising.
Virgo rising was definitely better. That's the thing, is if it had been Virgo rising, then it would have been that Mercury in Gemini in its own domicile in the 10th. But unfortunately, they evidently did not consult with us or did not consult with astrologers, because we would have given a better launch chart.
Yeah.
One interesting thing though that's almost shocking that they didn't consult with astrologers is that the crew named the spaceship capsule Calypso, which is from an ancient Greek word, which means to cover, to conceal, or to hide. And I thought that was really brilliant symbolism because it was launched right on the Venus cazimi when Venus is literally concealed or hidden or eclipsed in terms of the being under the beams of the sun.
Right. Okay. So same root as the clips and eclipse.
Right. Yeah,
Oh,
exactly.
that's really interesting.
Yeah. So that was cool. Fingers crossed that it comes back okay and everyone's waiting for their safe return.
Yeah.
So that was June 5th, the exact same day on June 5th. So this is during the Gemini stellium and the Venus conjunct Sun cazimi. The FAA in the United States gave approval to a company named Archer, which is an EVTOL, electric takeoff and landing vehicle company, to operate an electric air taxi service, basically. And this is only the second company in the United States to get approval for these basically like electric flying cars, essentially, that eventually will fly autonomously and fly people around cities in relatively short distance using what are essentially like big drones that people can ride in. So that fit the symbolism really well. That ties way back into stuff we were talking about in the year ahead forecast, where that's kind of what I was anticipating for Jupiter and Gemini to become a major news story. And it started happening like right on the cazimi.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And with Gemini, these like should we say like quick, efficient, like practical applications. Like with Gemini, it's such a clever is such a good keyword. It's like, oh, that's a clever thing to do with that technology, right? Like there's a quickness and a cleverness. Like, oh, let's do that. It'll fix this problem or to make this easier. And Gemini is, sometimes too clever for its own good, but there's that like slightly, how should we say, application minded, maybe willing to cut corners, but maybe it's just like smart and time saving. Like there's a cleverness to that, right? Like Gemini, it's not that Gemini as a mode is entirely opposed to like big blue sky yeah, cosmological fundamental science research, but Gemini and Mercury really excel at that like application. Like, what do we do with this? How do we solve a problem? Or what's something cool we can do with it?
Yeah, for sure. And also the other thing is it's expanding with Jupiter and Gemini, it's expanding the definition of what short distance travel is
Mhm.
and how that can be done. And it's also integrating eventually new technologies and combining them together. It's like you get drones, which is something we've seen really become prominent in different ways over the past decade, but also it's going to be combining it with artificial intelligence in order so that these air taxis, that it'll be happening autonomously and people won't be flying them manually. So it's interesting seeing different technologies come together at this important crossroads in terms of the astrology as well.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting to see, back to kind of how we were thinking about it last month. There's, you have all these planets in Gemini, all these new technologies or new developments on technological trajectories. And there's so much promise and so much maybe. But then all the and so we thought that there would be a number of applications and ideas and things would get moving with all the planets in Gemini, but then we have Saturn overlooking everything, and so there was always this how is this going to work out in the long term? Maybe this will take longer to become fully operational than we initially thought. Like Saturn was there posing this question, right? Like the with the Boeing launch, right? It's like the launch worked, but then there's a problem later on, and it's literally just taking longer, like you said earlier. And so it's interesting to have all of this like quick, clever, inventive, practical, fun energy, but with Saturn looking on, right? Posing questions about the future, right? Like
Yeah.
which of these many quick, clever, bright, swift things will make it through, right? Will we look back on and say, oh, that debuted during that month, and then made it through whatever problems later arose, and then which ones in retrospect will look damned by that superior conjunction or superior square from Saturn.
Yeah, that's a great point also because what that was that day was literally a regulation company like giving them approval to do something, but that's actually one of the biggest hurdles towards this technology becoming ubiquitous in the US is the FAA is putting very stringent guidelines and restrictions in terms of letting them have to pass through certain things, and that's going to be one of the greatest challenges to whether we have flying taxis like flying around in the next few years is if the regulators allow that. Whereas in other companies like China or like Dubai or something, they're kind of really ushering in and like rubber stamping some of this technology so that it's probably going to take off faster than it may in the US. So that's actually even more insightful than you realize.
Oh, yeah, okay, thank you. Good.
Yeah,
That's
keep it up. Um,
yeah, I'll try.
all right.
It's the glasses.
Yeah, I can already feel it. It's like your Clark Kent type thing going on here, but as an astrology superhero. So another major thing that I saw, there was two instances of like financial things, and I think this is an important aspect of Gemini that's often overlooked in modern times, because in ancient astrology, like with Vedic Valens and other ancient astrologers, they would often talk about the mercantile or money-related significations connected to Mercury. And one of the things that happened right on June 5th on this Gemini lineup was the company BlackRock announced that they were going to launch a new stock exchange in the state of Texas. And this stock exchange is supposed to sort of like compete with the New York Stock Exchange, which is the main like hub or center for that in the United States at this point. So it remains to be seen like how that goes, but it was potentially an interesting overlooked story that could have important long-term implications in terms of finances and other things in the future in this country. The same day, the cryptocurrency company Coinbase released a new smart wallet, which is supposed to make it easier for people to start using cryptocurrencies as it's really easy to set up on your phone. So that was another like weird, like mercantile thing happening on the same day. And then finally, the only other major news story that I wrote down for that day is that the Georgia courts delayed Trump's election interference case, which, as a Sun Venus conjunction in his 11th house, actually ended up being very fortunate for him because it means it will push that court case back after the election, basically, instead of before it. And that was one of the cases actually that could have really interfered with his ability to have the election and become president potentially in November. So that was an interesting, again, like turning point, an important news story. I'm sure there's a bunch of other news stories that happened around that time, around June 4th and 5th. So,
I have a personal one.
okay.
So that cazimi, that sun, and then the sun new moon, like in right around that degree. I noticed last year was going to be on the degree of my natal moon. And so, there won't be another exact Venus Sun conjunction on the degree of my natal moon for the rest of my life.
Hmm.
Right. And the frequency of transits tells you something about their significance, right? Like a Pluto transit, like Pluto going over your ascendant, will happen, during one period in your life and will only happen for maybe a third of people will get that transit. And that's if they live a good long life. And so while Venus hits that degree every year, I was like, oh, that's pretty rare. Like that'll happen once. And then I thought about it. I was like, well, it seems pleasant, right? Like that can't be bad. And so I kind of forgot about it until last month when we were talking about what's happening and where and when, and I re-noticed that it was on the exact degree of my moon. And then I found myself in early June, um, just how should we say, having this is I'm going to try to not make this too sappy, but like super bonding with my baby, like just like really falling deeply in love and just super like really deep rapport with Lucian. um and I looked up at the astrology, and like lo and behold, it was the Venus cazimi on the degree of my moon, with in the same degree. Like that's what was happening, as I was just sort of like, wow, this is really like profound, like emotionally profound and honestly life changing, right? It's it's falling in love. It's falling in a type of love I've never been in before. And so I was just very in the experience, but then perked up for a second. I was like, is this the Venus Sun conjunction like on the degree of the natal moon? And like sure enough, it was happening as I thought that. And so, with it's interesting because we don't usually talk about, or there's a tendency to talk about Venus purely in terms of romantic relationships. And
Hmm.
Venus certainly has 100 things to say about romantic relationships. Um, and this was, very much an experience of of love, right? It's love in a very particular way, but not of a romantic kind. And so it was just interesting to look up and see that, and to get a little reminder of the wider range of what Venus means when Venus says love. And
Yeah.
once in a lifetime, in the sense that even if I continue to procreate, there will never be another first time having that experience.
Right. Yeah, that's actually really beautiful. And that's really fitting. Uh, Just one of the things is like sometimes negative transits are so stark that they really stand out to us when they're happening and also in our memories. Whereas sometimes when a positive transit's happening, sometimes we can overlook the positive thing that's happening right in front of us because it's like smoother. The edges are not as jagged. But it's nice sometimes when you do have a positive transit and you experience something like that, that you recognize what's happening as it's happening.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, yeah. It was really nice and very cazimi solar-esque. It felt like, um I mean, I guess I don't know, sort of like the beam from a lighthouse cutting through the darkness of being a middle-aged human, having seen enough light, or excuse me, having seen enough life, that there's a semi there's a semi grim and miserable sort of framing to things. If you've been around a while and paying attention, I'm in my Saturn opposition, and I'm also not famed for my over the top positivity. We could add that the last I don't know, X number of years have not been particularly inspiring as far as the world, but it was just like this, this beautiful, bright sort of lighthouse beam cutting through that. Is really nice.
I think what you're saying is you're going soft on me, so I'm gonna have to be the one that comes up with the like dark metaphors like meat grinder in the future.
Well, I mean, in many ways, it merely serves to highlight the overwhelming darkness by contrast.
Okay.
It's a little bit of the last scene of True Detective, right? Looking at the ratio of light to darkness in the night sky, and then speculating about that.
Brilliant. I love that. All right. Well, don't go too soft on me. We need some of those metaphors coming up later this year with like the Mars retrograde and stuff. Um, so if people noticed other news stories that happened around the time of the June 4th, June 5th lineup in Gemini and the cazimi, let me know in the comments, especially below this video on YouTube, just because I know there's other little stuff that happened that I may have overlooked and things that may look like they have small beginnings, but could actually become much more consequential in terms of long-term history, which I think each of these news stories we just talked about will or does. So, all right. So moving on to other transits, one of the things that happened is Mars moved from Aries into Taurus this month. And the day that Mars went into Taurus, a bunch of people sent me this news story about how a bull at a rodeo jumped over a fence and like hurt three people. And that seems like kind of a small little inconsequential news story, but it's just funny because sometimes stuff like that happens. There was another ingress like that back in like, January 6th of 2021. That was the day that Mars moved into Taurus. And then all the over the news, one of the stories from that day was that guy that was like wearing the bull horns that went in and like was trashing the Capitol. So sometimes stuff like that happens that does fit the symbolism in some striking way, and it shows up in the news and is worth noting.
Yeah, it's almost more of an omen, or it plays that omen role of saying being a thing in of itself, but saying something about the dynamics at that invisible level.
Yeah, for sure. Because that just is one instance at the surface level of stuff that's happening beneath the surface on like multiple levels that we're just not seeing, national news stories about.
Yeah, reminds me of the like some of the fish and sea life stuff that we've gotten at various points in the Saturn and Pisces years.
Yeah, for sure. So let's see, moving on, shortly after that ingress, the day of the Mars-Pluto square, the main headline story was about the Hunter Biden conviction. So both of those actually were really interesting. After our last forecast, Trump was convicted and it was under like a Mars-Saturn transit. And then Hunter Biden was convicted like a few weeks later, and that was also under a Mars-Saturn transit. So let me explain both of those really quickly. So Trump's was first, where Trump became the first former US president convicted of felony crimes or felony charges when a New York jury found him guilty of all 34 charges of illegally influencing the 2016 election through hush money payments to a porn star who said that the two had had sex, that they were trying to cover up before the 2016 election. So on that day that the conviction happened, transiting Mars was transiting through Trump's ninth house, and it squared his Saturn in the 12th house. And this was notable and important because Saturn was actually the ruler of the year according to annual perfections. So let me show the transits to that because it was really striking, and like all the astrologers noted it immediately. And what was weird about it is Mars was actually like right on the descendant at 23 Aries when the verdict came down and when Trump learned of it. So I thought this was striking because then both the ninth house and the 12th house are kind of associated with the courts and with law and different things like this. And it was literally something that was like negative happening to Trump as a result of the courts. So we see Mars there at 23 degrees of Aries, and it's squaring his Saturn at 23 degrees of Cancer, and he was in a Saturn perfection year. So the other thing that was notable transit wise is that transiting Mercury was at 23 Taurus, and it was conjoining Uranus at 24 degrees of Taurus, right on top of the degree of Trump's midheaven, which is at 24 degrees of Taurus. So he had a Mercury-Uranus conjunction right on his midheaven when he learned this news that he had just been convicted of this crime. So what's interesting about that is um, he's scheduled to be sentenced on July 11th, 2024, coming up here next month. And one of the things that when I looked at the transits for that I noticed immediately is remember how Mercury was at 23 degrees of Taurus when he was convicted. Well, on the day of his sentencing, Mars will actually be at 23 degrees of Taurus, conjoining his midheaven at 24 degrees of Taurus. So I thought that was really interesting that it's like on the day of the conviction, you get Mercury there conjoining Uranus on the midheaven, and then on the day of the actual sentencing, whatever that ends up being, he has that Mars Uranus conjunction hitting his midheaven at that time.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's squaring his Mars and configured to his natal Saturn. Yeah, there's something to be said for the malefics being sometimes an oversimple description of Mars and Saturn, and yet when you look at a subjective bad happening to a person like getting convicted of a crime, it's not a glorious Venus transit that the person is having. It's interesting that that the conviction, in addition to Saturn just stressing both the sun and moon for him, that that Mars was squaring the natal Saturn. One, because as you said, he was in a Saturn-led year, and so that would have more impact. But just thinking of the nature of the charge and charges and the conviction, it's Saturn in the 12th, right? The crime is obscuration, doing secret things, trying to meddle with things, behind the scenes or beneath the surface, which is what we always say about the 12th house. And of course, with Venus conjoined the natal Saturn in the 12th house, secret stuff involving love affairs, sex, or maybe not love, but lust affairs, sex, women, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, what he was going to get in trouble for is that Venus Saturn in the 12th, which if you're looking at things that are favorable in that chart and not, you'd be like, oh, that seems like a problem, right? And so that activated is what he's convicted for when it becomes a problem very quite publicly and legally.
Yeah, as well as the 12th having to do with self-undoing,
Mm,
since it was like an act of his own choice that kind of unraveled there. But then also the 12th has traditionally has to do with prisons. And even
hmm
though I don't, they're not expected to sentence him to prison based on this, it's interesting that there's even just the specter of like
right.
that's even a possibility coming up.
Right,
Um,
right. That's a much more relevant topic at this point than at any other point in his life, probably.
right, for sure. So anyway, so that was really interesting as a transit and is ongoing. And then, like I said, on the day of the Mars Pluto square, the main headline story was that um, Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, was convicted on felony gun charges. And here is the chart for that, where we can see that his natal Saturn is at 2 degrees of Taurus, and it's opposite his Jupiter at 5 degrees of Scorpio. And he was again like Trump, he was in a Saturn profection year. So Saturn is activated as the Time Lord of the year. And so that Saturn at 2 degrees of Taurus was getting hit by transiting Mars, which was at 1 degree of Taurus and moved into 2 degrees within 24 hours. And Mars was very closely squaring Pluto at 1 degree of Aquarius. So we see a similar thing there with Trump. It was like Mars squaring Saturn, and with Hunter Biden, it was Mars conjoining Saturn, and he was found guilty of illegally buying a gun while under the influence of drugs and like misfilling out some legal forms or something like that. But it ended up being interesting because it was sort of a parallel with Trump in the sense that he was the first child of a sitting president to be convicted of a felony. Um, so yeah, that transit, and it was interesting just seeing some of those parallels astrologically.
Yeah, and in terms of when a person is going to be punished or convicted of something, having Saturn and Pisces across the natal midheaven, right? Having Saturn come visit your midheaven, which is your among other things, your public reputation, makes a lot of sense. And then with the North Node, he has the North Node there natally, right? So there's often with the North Node on the midheaven, you have just there's a shadow over a person's reputation, just as the North Node indicates eclipses, right? There's like a there's a smudge or a stain or a shadow over the reputation, and we have that natally, and then Saturn, excuse me, Saturn at transiting Saturn, activating that or adding to that, while we have the Mars Saturn and the square from Pluto to the natal Saturn, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, for sure. And then of course, it's like Biden's chart itself, that Saturn's transiting his fifth house right now. No, or sorry, I was thinking about the eclipses. So you're talking about eclipses, and Hunter Biden has Aries 10th whole sign house. So the recent Aries eclipses that just occurred the previous month were in his 10th, as
Mhm.
well as his fourth house of like parents. And then Joe Biden with his Sagittarius rising, the Aries eclipse that occurred right before the trial and right before his son's conviction was in his fifth house.
Right. And so you also see in Joe's chart that the Mars, which conjoined Hunter's Saturn, also immediately conjoined Joe's moon, right?
Mm.
Which is the moon is one of the two luminaries, right? And so, and the moon is that which you hold close. It's traditionally associated with family. And so same transit, same Mars moving into early Taurus, while in a square with Pluto, and that being a conviction for the son, and no doubt a very unpleasant moment for the father.
Yeah, well, that's funny because that's the parallel between what you were just talking about earlier in your instance of like the Venus cazimi on your moon and having this instance of feeling this great, love and outpouring between you and your newborn son versus Biden having the Mars transiting over his moon and having this, negative thing happen to his kid.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. All right. So that is part of what was happening there. Other news stories, the Saturn Neptune conjunction and the impending Saturn Neptune station pretty much dominated most of the news stories in the entire second half of the month. The big one that started happening around the middle of the month, around June 12th, there was this company called Luma Labs AI, which launched a new AI text to video generator called the Dream Machine, which not only produces surprisingly impressive AI videos, but it's also open for people to use. So it's like earlier this year, OpenAI released that video generator, which we talked about on the show and was so striking, but it was closed off and only like a certain amount of people could use it because they were still testing it basically. But this month, under the Saturn Neptune conjunction, this company released one of these really advanced video generators for anybody to use. And all of a sudden on social media, there was just this explosion of people creating AI generated videos that some of them just looked very lifelike. There's explosion of creativity. One of the things that was crazy is that this video generator, or some of them, because this wasn't the only one that was released, there's actually two or three other companies that then also released different versions of AI video generators to keep up with what was happening. One of the things that was cool about it, though, is that it could take still images of anything and then animate it and turn it into a lifelike video. And so people were taking like old famous memes from like a decade ago and they were turning it into like a real life video that was suddenly like moving or talking. They were taking famous paintings like the Mona Lisa or other paintings and suddenly making it come alive. They were even taking old viral selfies with like celebrities. Like there was this famous one from like the Oscars 10 years ago where there was like 20 celebrities that all took a selfie and somebody fed it into the video machine and it animated and it made it come alive, even though it's just a still picture. So we're just seeing some really crazy stuff happening with on the one hand, it being increasingly hard to distinguish between what is real and what is not, and also that there are things that were only fiction that are being brought alive. So there's interesting like creative possibilities, but then also yeah, it's becoming increasingly hard to tell the difference between what's real and what's illusory.
Yeah, yeah, but very, very on target, very much. What we've been seeing, what we expected. It's interesting. It makes me think about, it's something to play. Like right now, it's like something fun to play with, and it makes me think of Gemini and play, right? Because Mercury has certainly has a mercantile quality, but Gemini is also very playful, right? And
Mm.
most games involve being clever, right? And a lot of games are competitive. Not all games are, but there's like cleverness. It's like something to play with, right? And play, I don't mean play in like a demeaning or diminutive sense, right? Because a lot of very important things come out of play. But with, with this giant stellium and Gemini, like getting new things to play with, is certainly something that came out, or is certainly a feature of it. One of the things I noticed was just that there seemed to be a lot of entertainment, a lot of it pretty good that came out during that stellium. Um, among other things, we had important to me, we had the second season of House of the Dragon premiere, but there were a bunch of shows where there were seasons. I was like waiting for the next season, and there were several shows where the next season dropped, one, two, three, all in the midst of this Gemini stellium. There were some good video games that were released, and uh, sort of coined this. We ended up, for some reason, playing Lucian the soundtrack to the Persona series, and mostly Persona 5, Persona 3, 4, and 5. And he loves that, like those songs. So we ended up playing like J-pop video game music for the baby while all these entertainments were coming out. Anyway, just sort of characterize my what I saw during the this not unprecedented but pretty rare pileup of planets in Gemini, right?
Yeah, for sure. Well, and it's just cool because it's very Gemini in terms of people are taking text, they're typing something like an idea or a paragraph, and then it's being fed into, and you get the Saturn, Neptune, and Pisces component where it's turning into a real life thing where their sentence or paragraph has come alive and turned into a living video. People are using it to direct entire like trailers or music videos at this point. It's actually getting kind of crazy how fast things are moving. So, we'll continue to see an acceleration of that because Neptune's about to station early in July, as we'll talk about here in this episode just in a little bit. But this is still only the beginning of some of this stuff.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah. And again, it'll be so interesting to see, again, all of this is it's all of this quick, fun Gemini action, like against the backdrop of, under the oversight of slow moving, judgmental, consequence oriented Saturn, right? Like how will we view the debut of these things in 5 years or with time, right? Like Saturn is just there sort of guaranteeing that all of this is front and center in the eye of time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're going to look back on this period and just realize like this was a huge period where some of this stuff got out of control in the sense that it started becoming really hard to tell the difference between what's real and what's not. And some of these clips are going to start influencing people's perception of like news, of politics, and different things like that. But it's increasingly becoming clear like why that is. And I saw like a talk recently, even by the founder of Twitter, who left the company a while ago, saying that the ability to tell the difference, that you basically can't trust your senses anymore, and anything that you see online, especially in terms of video, like you're not going to be able to trust, and it's going to be a whole learning curve that people have gone through different versions of this in the past. Like at the Saturn Neptune conjunction 8 years ago when we had the fake news stuff happening, But it's going to take a learning curve of 2 to 3 years before people learn how to deal with this and learn how to navigate it and learn that you can't just take for granted video footage of things anymore. And that's going to be something that a lot of us, it's going to take some time to get used to, but eventually we will, especially once that conjunction starts separating.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. Human beings are good at adaptation if you give us a couple years or sometimes a couple decades. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see like what is more consequential than it looks like right now, and what looks like it'll be amazing and terrifying and ends up being a sort of big wet fart, right? Because some of what we're seeing will be the new meta. By new meta, I don't mean the most advantageous strategy in an online game, but like the Zuckerberg virtual reality immersion social network bullshit that didn't work at all. Like some of this stuff is going to be there are going to be some profound failures that look amazing right now, and there's going to be some stuff that looked okay right now that ends up being very consequential and very important, with time.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so that brings us to the last news story, which is the one that literally just happened last night, which is the presidential debate that just took place, where Saturn's stationing literally in the next like 24 hours in Pisces. And my observation, like right before the debate, is that the two oldest candidates for president in history were going to do a debate as Saturn was stationing retrograde. And that's sort of what we knew going into it. But and then of course that manifested in a very striking way, where the debate was widely seen as going bad for Biden, and well for Trump. And Saturn was actually stationing at 19 degrees of Pisces, which was right on Biden's IC. So here is the chart for that, just to give people a visual. There it is. So Biden with Sagittarius rising, his IC is around 19 degrees of Pisces, and Saturn's stationing there at 19 degrees of Pisces right now. And of course, the moon went through Pisces, was going through Pisces last night, where it was conjoining Saturn as well as conjoining Neptune. And it seemed like it was that Saturn Neptune conjunction that really came out, where I saw one commenter say that the contrast last night was basically between lies versus old, because Biden was looking much older and like more frail. He seemed like he had been sick recently, and his voice was very weak and it wasn't coming out well, especially in the very beginning of the debate. And he was losing his train of thought at different points, and sort of like struggling to keep up, but was otherwise on certain points trying to stick to certain like policy statements in terms of his accomplishments or contrasting with Trump's, versus for Trump, he was kind of just doing what he usually does, and he was kind of making up a lot of stuff as he went. But as the debate went on, it basically became clear that Biden was really kind of like struggling to put on a good performance, whereas Trump was doing relatively well. And oh yeah, last part about that is so Biden was getting that really negative transit to his chart, but at the same time, Trump was actually having a very positive transit for his chart, where transiting Uranus in his 10th house on his midheaven was actually closely sextiling his Venus. And that was one of the closest transits that he had, which was important because Venus is the ruler of his 10th house. So it's like transiting Uranus sextile the ruler of the 10th house almost exactly within 9 minutes. And he had this sort of surprisingly successful first debate.
Yeah, well, and just Jupiter being in Gemini, and bolstering the sun in his chart.
Yeah, Jupiter's in Gemini. There's other stuff that's coming up, like the transiting the Mars Uranus conjunction, which will be on his midheaven around the sentencing, or transiting Uranus once it gets past 25 and gets to 26, it will square his natal Mars at 26 Leo. So we're sort of like in between sort of difficult period, but at least for last night, it seemed like yeah, a lot of people were disappointed in Biden's performance, and now there's all these questions about whether he like a lot of the Democrats are faltering and are nervous about whether he needs to step down or whether he should stick with it, or are they going to do a second debate? That's supposed to be scheduled for September around the time of the Pisces eclipse, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, there's a lot of questions at this point, and I know there's just a lot of disappointment on the Democratic side about how things went.
Yeah, it's interesting how much in some ways it simplifies back to its moon with Saturn while Saturn's stationing. Like you said about the story going in, like, oh, this is the oldest pair of candidates we've ever had for president debating. And then what people are discussing afterwards is the age of Joe Biden, right? Or their how not just the age, but like what age has done, right? Because not everybody at 82 is equal, is in the same boat. And so like just Saturn, like that's the age. And so that reminds me of something you were saying to me the other day that I thought was really interesting and relevant, which was that Reagan's astrologer, was it Joan Quigley, would intentionally schedule debates so that the planets were favorable for Ronald and the very opposite for whoever his opponent is.
Yeah, that was actually something I was really thinking about last night was how did last night, because it was scheduled so early. Like the debates are usually in the fall in like
Hmm.
September and October, but this is the first time a debate had been scheduled months and months earlier, even before we don't even know who Trump's like vice presidential candidate is yet, and
Hmm.
they haven't done the conventions. But for some reason, last night was picked as the day of the debate, and Saturn was stationing right on the IC of Biden, and it really was reminiscent of and reminded me of how Joan Quigley, the astrologer for Ronald Reagan, said in her book that one of her strategies for helping Reagan as an astrologer was that she picked debate days that would be bad for Carter and would be good for Reagan. So it was kind of reminiscent of that and made me wonder a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. It's certainly like if I were running for an office and there were a lot of concerns about my age, I would not consent to a debate with the moon on Saturn while I was stationing.
Yeah, especially right opposite the degree of my midheaven. So, the second debate is scheduled for 1 week before the Pisces eclipse, I believe in September. That eclipse is in Biden's fourth house and it's in Kamala Harris's 10th house. So, in the year ahead forecast, one of the things that I said was that it seemed like there were like three different factors I could see that looked good for Trump in terms of winning the election. And there was one that looked good for Biden, and it was that eclipse. But that eclipse still makes me a little nervous because eclipses are, major beginnings, but also major endings. And because it's taking place in his fourth house, which already has to do with endings, and it's taking place in Harris's 10th house, which sometimes has to do with, being elevated in terms of one's career, what that's going to be like and if he'll be able to stick through it through the election, or if somehow if he's not, if that eclipse is relevant in terms of that, in terms of how it hits both of their charts. Yeah, so
Yeah.
we will see how that goes and continue to follow it as things play out over the next few months. But I think that was it in terms of the major news stories that I wrote down that had a really clear astrological correlation. I'm sure there were many other news stories, but in the interests of keeping things concise and keeping this to an hour for this first part, I think that's good for news stories. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's great. I Yeah.
All right, so let's transition into talking about the forecast for July now. So, big picture stuff, the main things this month are going to be the Saturn Neptune conjunction, which is super close, with Neptune stationing early in the month to join Saturn stationing in Pisces. That energy is going to be dominant for the first couple of weeks, still at least, of the month. Then in the middle of the month, we have Mars conjoining Uranus, which is the most volatile aspect of the month around the 14th and 15th. The full moon on the 21st seems to be incredibly consequential because there's so many aspects that are taking place at the same time. And then finally, at the end of the month, there's some weird tensions between Mercury and Mars, which seem like very combative, communicative energy that are happening when Mercury and Mars almost come into a square, but then Mercury slows down and moves into a retrograde at the beginning of August. So those are some of like the big picture things, but I think the main thing to talk about for the opening is just that Neptune station that's happening right on the second of the month, because that's really going to intensify some of the things we're already experiencing in terms of Saturn having just stationed. Yeah. So how are you
So,
feeling about Saturn Neptune at this point?
oh, I mean, how does the fish feel about the fish tank? How does the fish feel about the aquarium that it's been in for over a year? It's hard to not take it to take the ambient confusion and ontological and historical uncertainty as just the baseline, right? Like it doesn't jump out at this point. So it's just like, yeah, so what what's going on? Something important probably happens next, but this period is so ill-defined. um like with just to jump back to some of the technological developments, like, oh, these things are happening, but what does that mean for the future, right? And we just get a thousand wild ideas. Or like, we just talked about the debate. um I, like many other people, was not super excited that these are the two candidates for president, but what does that mean about the country, right? Like you immediately want to think about, okay, but what does that mean going forward for the technology stuff? What does that mean going forward, as far as the leadership stuff? And then, 20 other, there are 20 other topics that I feel like beg the question, or like, what should we say, have strong implications and yet are very difficult to unmuddy, as far as like, yeah, but what does it actually mean going forward? And that's the Neptune Saturn years, especially in Pisces.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think some of the significations that are becoming clear right now is, like I said, blurring the lines between reality and fantasy and making it difficult to distinguish between what's real and what's not. We're seeing that in terms of technology, but I'm sure there's ways that people are seeing that in much more practical levels in terms of their own personal lives. There's also this tension between idealism versus realism is very common under Saturn Neptune aspects, between sometimes like the idealistic aspirations that one has versus what happens when you run into a wall of practical limitations. Also feelings of like disillusionment and disappointment, especially when dreams or ideals clash with the harsh realities of what's actually going on. Those are some themes that I think are pretty common. Other things, confusion and uncertainty, fatigue and a sapping of one's mental and physical energy, I think is also notable during this time under the Saturn Neptune conjunction. That's a pretty common one. Lack of mental acuity, side effects of, I mean, the thing we saw, in terms of that, this reminded me of last night was sometimes side effects of age leading to lack of mental clarity or focus. There's many different like manifestations of that, but sometimes for individuals, no matter their age, you can sometimes under a Saturn transit feel your age like catching up to you at different points, and what the impact that that can have, not just mentally, but also sometimes in terms of your physical energy and vitality. I think all of that becomes relevant as this conjunction gets closer and closer, and some of that, the diffuse feeling becomes more ever present.
Yeah, definitely. Another, I think one thing that tracks with that Saturn Neptune, in the sense of Saturn bringing an end to things, or declaring how how past their time or past due things are. I think it's pretty clear that in terms of Hollywood or box office Hollywood, that the superhero era is really at an end. Led by the Marvel movies. Even though the first was it Iron Man, which was kind of the first big Marvel movie that made a bunch of money, was earlier than Neptune's movement into Pisces in 2011, 2012. The time since Neptune moved into Pisces, as far as like commercially produced, or like high budget commercial imagining, right? And imaginary worlds that people have spent time in, the the big comic book movies, the big Marvel movies absolutely dominated the last 12 years. And though there have been, although the returns have been less and less for several years now, it looks like, based on, corporate bottom lines and profits and all of that, that's sort of over, or it's just about over, right? Which is Neptune stationing at 29 degrees. And Neptune will make its first ingress into Aries in 9 months, right? This Neptune and Pisces era is almost over. And that would be true regardless of what Saturn is doing. But adding Saturn to that makes the finality, or the, how should we say, like, time, all destroyer, swiftly approaching, and underlines that quality. And so with that, again, like popular imagination, it's like, well, we're kind of all tired of imagining that, right? Like, people are tired of imagining Marvel superheroes. And there are probably other franchises that's relevant too. But those movies have made the most money over this past period.
Yeah, we're definitely getting to the end of an era creatively. And we can see that very literally this month when Neptune stations, it's stationing exactly at 29 degrees and 55 minutes. You literally cannot get any later in the sign before it dips into Aries. And I think we can feel some of that energy in the air right now in terms of being at the end of an era, and an era that we've been in for more than a decade now, with Neptune transiting through that sign. At the same time, so obviously we're on the cusp of a shift when it comes to that, which we're really going to encounter next year when Saturn and Neptune go into Aries. But at the same time, we're also just seeing this explosion of creativity. And one of the breaking down of boundaries, or the dissolving of boundaries that's happening, is just a lot of people are being given tools in order to do things that are incredibly creative in bringing their imaginations alive and making them real and concrete, that I think has never been possible before. So there's something interesting about that, that may be part of the catalyst as Neptune eventually moves into Aries, is each person having the ability to be much more creative than perhaps we've ever been able to be at any other point in time.
Well, I mean, it doesn't make people more creative. We're talking about like a better set of tools, or a more powerful set of tools. Um, it doesn't mean people's ideas are better, or that they have more, more meaningful or interesting things to communicate. But as far as the tools, like, you're right. This is like, it's you know, it's a much more, or it's a whole new set of tools. And whenever we get new sets of tools, like film, for example, we get like the opportunity to, or how should we say, like, new mediums result, or as new instruments were created, like the electric guitar. It made new genres of music possible. And so I think, what you're saying about that, and with Neptune about to enter a fiery and cardinal sign, that there are like genres, or like styles, there are types of things that will be created that don't exist yet. Just like, before YouTube became accessible, people weren't doing video essays, right? Whereas,
Right.
like, the video essay is a thing now. That kind of sort of existed as documentaries before, but not really. And so, what is birthed from the intersection of people and these new tools?
Well, and that's one of the things you have to understand about what's happening right now, though, is that it's taking it so that a person doesn't have to have like a huge amount of money, or not just money, but also skill. Like sometimes people would need the aptitude to draw, or have an actual talent for like drawing or something like that, in order to create a beautiful work of art. But now that talent, in terms of the mechanical ability with their hands, is not a barrier anymore. Or in the 1990s, for example, remember like the first Toy Story movie cost millions and millions of dollars for Pixar to produce a computer generated entire motion picture film. But now all of a sudden, I saw somebody create an animated, almost like feature film, entirely using AI generated art. that looked like it was animated by Pixar, and that was just done by a single person, not like $1 million production team. There's
Hmm.
something about that that's going to maybe democratize is not the word, but it's putting more power for creativity into individual people's hands, and it's removing some of the barriers to entry so that what a person has in their mind can be made manifest in a way that perhaps was never possible before or would have at least been much harder to achieve.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And that's been sort of happening for the last 20, 25 years, right? Like it used to be that if you wanted to get a book published, you had to go through a publisher, right?
Mhm.
Whereas now publishing tools are infinitely more accessible, which has benefited me and you. There is the question though, are books better now?
I mean, that's a subjective question.
I don't know if it's entirely subjective, but I meant it to be rhetorical, right? I don't I think it's not they're not clearly better. There are some things that wouldn't have been published that are, and I'm happy for that. But it's not like books like taking away like making some of the removing some of the barriers to entry doesn't like it didn't transform what it didn't transform books in a radical way. Um, where like literature just got infinitely better once it got cheaper to do. And so I just say that too because I don't want to assume that people will get better at art because the tools are more accessible, because we've been watching that happen, and there's stuff that wouldn't have existed if that hadn't have changed that I'm glad that existed, or that I'm glad that exists. But it's not like it wasn't like a quantum leap in cultural production.
Yeah, well, I mean, to the extent that, for example, YouTube as it is today was a huge shift that our generation watched happen over the past 10 to 15 years, where all of a sudden there's a bunch of people that can make a living producing creative content constantly as just independent creators. We're about to see another similar shift of some sort that's happening now. So we'll see how that plays out over the course of the next decade. And I'm sure it'll have positive and negative consequences, but it's definitely a shift that we're right on the cusp of. And we can see that astrologically with Neptune being like right at the border of that sign.
Yeah, and I just
Um,
want to reaffirm that I think that putting it in individual hands is a really good call with Neptune in Aries. Aries is the
right.
most like, here I go again on my own, like solo adventure, protagonist, just me and what I can and can't do sort of sign. And so Neptune moving there, and looking at these tools being graspable and affordable by a lot of individuals, I think is a really good call.
For sure. Some of the other keywords for Saturn Neptune, escapism and addiction as a potential downside to that, but also sensitivity and compassion. Um, though one of the contrasts I'm actually seeing comes to like religion and versus science. Science versus religion is a major Saturn Neptune crossroads thing when you have hard aspects, or alternatively, skepticism versus belief. And I've been seeing some like trends lately that are making me a little nervous in terms of that, where I'm seeing, on the one hand, a rise of certain demographic of people converting to like Christianity, for example, and finding something interesting or finding solace in more established religion. But then also, I'm occasionally seeing a resurgence of like scientific skepticism at the same time. And it's been interesting seeing both of those play out on different ends of the spectrum, but still archetypally connected with that underlying archetype of Saturn and Neptune.
Interesting, interesting. I don't have anything to add to that right now. I'm going to think about that. That's not something I've been watching.
Okay. Yeah, I've just been noticing that a bunch of conservative influencers have been converting to Christianity, and I think we're seeing the early stages of that now, but it could be something that becomes larger over the next few years. And then obviously we'll have different impacts for different communities, including our own as astrologers. If astrologers end up on the bad end of that, as they have at different points in history, whereas other points in history, astrologers have gotten along a little bit with that movement, but we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, right. Well, it's like which version of Christian there are all sorts of different kinds. with all sorts of different attitudes, tolerant and otherwise, to astrology and other dark arts.
Sure. Yeah. All right. So that's some of the Saturn Neptune stuff. I think that's going to peak in the first couple of days of the month, especially because Mercury is actually going to trine Neptune right as Neptune's stationing before Mercury departs from Cancer. So here we see it on
Hmm.
July 1st at 28 and 29 degrees of Cancer, trining Neptune as it's stationing at 29 degrees. Um, so everybody should pay attention to that if you have sensitive degrees, especially around 19 or 29 degrees of the mutable signs. Those are really going to get activated by that Saturn Neptune station at this time. The Mercury trine to Neptune is kind of nice in terms of potentially like a boosting creativity and the more creative side of that station, at least on that day. So we'll probably see some stuff in the news related to the ongoing emergence of some of those new creative outlets.
And also
So
just mellow for communications. Like good, Neptune's boundary erosion can be very bad for doing science or math or writing grocery lists. But that, especially by trine, that like dissolution of boundaries can be really good for connecting with people, especially with Mercury um, in a relatively or in a watery, emotionally centered sign like Cancer. Neptune can open the way to have like, a really, like a talk where you like a real talk with someone, not like the hard real talk that you've been putting off, but just like connecting a little bit,
for
less in the
sure.
way with Neptune.
Yeah, and those are some of the positive aspects this month is when those inner planets in Cancer trine Saturn in Pisces and Neptune in Pisces. So it's that Mercury trine, then we get like Venus first trining Saturn on July 2nd, and then later eventually it'll trine Neptune on the 10th, maybe 11th. And then eventually the sun will do the same thing. So those are some of like the positive flowing aspects that are happening this month. But then the downside is that immediately after the trines with Neptune happen, Mercury, for example, ingresses into Leo by July 2nd. And as soon as it ingresses into Leo, it immediately opposes Pluto. So this is going to be some of our first transits of finding out what it's like to have the inner planets this month move into Leo, and then immediately oppose Pluto in Aquarius.
Right. And Mercury with Pluto gives it casts a suspicious shadow over communications. It gives a little edge of paranoia to thinking, right? It's the what can't I see? What isn't this person saying? Right. It's uh that space that you can't see, and but it's the known unknown, right? Like, or it is the how should we say, the imagined unknown sometimes, like, well, but maybe they're not saying that because of X, Y, and Z, right? And so yeah, Mercury Pluto can be a little suspicious, a little paranoid. And as they say, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they aren't hiding things from you, but
Right.
sometimes you're just paranoid, right? And it's that it's that direction that opens up with Mercury Pluto.
Yeah, as we saw earlier this year at the conjunction, there's this desire to get to the bottom of things, to like dig deep underneath everything and find out what is really going on beneath the surface. And sometimes that can be positive in its highest manifestation as like the investigative reporter or the person who's like out to uncover the truth about something in its highest manifestation. In its lowest manifestation, though, as you said, it can be paranoia. It can be power struggles with people that happen verbally over communication. It can also be the control and manipulation of news and information in order to, sort of make people think something that may or may not be true.
Yeah. It's worth noting, I was looking over national charts the other day, and in the Sibley chart, there we talk about a lot, but one of the things that's really important is the United States has a tight Mercury Pluto opposition baked in from the beginning.
Mm,
And it's made me think about um sort of our recent struggles with sort of official stories and fake news and all of that, and how that has very strong bones in the natal chart of the US. This sort of paranoia about paranoia slash I don't know, justified suspicion, both and or and how that's in the natal chart for the US. And as long as we as long as the nation stands, that'll still be that chart, that nativity will still be an anchor point.
Yeah, totally. Well, that reminds me, during the last election in like 2020, Pluto was transiting over and opposing that Mercury, and we had all of these controversies about like the mail system, and it became politicized in terms of mail-in ballots and different things like that. So that goes to your point.
Yeah, and this time we're going to get Mars over that Mercury 3 times, before, during, after the election. I'm sure everyone will be pleased with the result, and we will agree that we have an excellent system, and we're all happy with the leadership that it has produced, and we'll move confidently further into the 21st century.
Yeah, and no one will contest the outcome of the election or have any questions surrounding. Actually, maybe we shouldn't be stating these things sarcastically, because then in the transcript it'll just come off as if we're making like straight predictions of that, and not the
That's so
tone
funny.
doesn't always convey.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Austin really has gone soft.
yeah, exactly.
This weirdly rosy picture he paints.
Right. All right. So
Back to now.
back to reality. Um, so Venus trines
Oh,
Saturn the
so
same day.
one thing I will add about the Mercury Pluto. So yeah, is it
Well,
paranoia? Is it
let's
not?
let's not dwell on it. Let's move.
No,
Let's
no,
keep
I'm
moving.
literally moving from Mercury moves on very quickly
Mhm.
into a sextile with Jupiter. And so though there might be a paranoid or kind of weird charged communication moment, Mercury is moving into a happy sextile with Jupiter right afterwards. And so that's the Mercury Pluto opposition is real, but it's kind of a blip on the radar because it gets replaced by a happy thing quite quickly.
Yeah, well, and that brings us to our first lunation of the month, which I actually really like this lunation, especially compared to the second one, where we have a new moon in the sign of Cancer at 14 degrees of Cancer on July 5th. And this really sets the tone for the first half of the month. And part of that tone is the sun moon conjunction happens, and then both of the luminaries apply to a nice trine with Saturn at 19 degrees of Pisces, while Venus is also there in Cancer with the sun and the moon. So we've got some nice flowing energy going on there that's relatively positive, and also at the same time, Mercury will be at 5 degrees of Leo, and it'll be applying to that sextile with reception with Jupiter, which is very good for communications with Jupiter and Gemini. So I think this is actually a pretty nice lunation, and I think that I don't see any like major tense aspects that look really terrible surrounding it.
No, I really like it. I really like a lot of July. There's like one um there's like one kind of deeply terrible thing. And then otherwise I really like a lot of July. It's either actively pleasant or like very workable. Something
Yeah.
about that the new moon in Cancer, trining the Saturn. It's still there's a Saturn influence, but by trine, it makes it easier to think about how to work with like how to work with like how to bear one's ongoing responsibilities with some grace, or how to manage difficulties that you're having that aren't going to go away this month. But it's sort of like, okay, but how do I work with that? Often, with Saturn and the burdens that Saturn signifies, if you redistribute the weight, it's much easier to carry it, right? It's like if I just put 50 pounds in one of your hands, you would walk lopsided and have back problems pretty quickly. But if we like evenly distributed an extra 50 pounds in a backpack and maybe some in the pockets, you could go about your day with a minimum of injury and discomfort, right? And so I guess that's part of the is it probably doesn't necessarily, it doesn't take away whatever burdens this part of life has, but if we can distribute them and carry them a little bit more evenly, the actual damage and discomfort can be minimized.
Mhm. That makes sense. That makes me this new moon trining Saturn there in Pisces. It makes me think of I can't remember who said it. It might be Harrison Ford who has like a Cancer stellium. But it was either him or some other famous director that was talking about how you have to have an emotional component to like a movie or to a scene in order to tie it in with it has to elicit like a feeling in order to really connect people to the script and to connect people to the actual like narrative of the story. So it's like Saturn Neptune, it's like you get the illusion and it's like all the special effects are going really well, but if you don't connect that into like
Mm,
the heart in some way, then people don't actually connect with it as much. And I didn't like as I get older, I'm coming to understand that component and how necessary that is. When I was younger, it's like sometimes I would be able to see script writers try to do stuff like that, but it would just come off as like sappy or come off as not, especially if it's done poorly, it comes off as like pandering or something like that. But if you have a good movie that has an emotional component, sometimes that makes the movie, it elevates the movie and makes you much more invested in what's actually going on. And that's what this new moon in Cancer connects me of because it's connecting something about the heart component or the emotional component of things with the sort of special effects component that's going on with Saturn and Neptune.
that's nice. Yeah. Um, Spectacle without story, right, is just noise and light,
Yeah, well, there's your superhero, movie thing that's been happening over
right?
the past
Which is
decade.
probably the critique, right?
Yeah,
All budget, no heart.
exactly. So that is that new moon, and yeah, its co-presence with Venus is also connecting in that heart component, that nurturing component, that's some of that energy that you were talking about earlier this month that you were experiencing in terms of your son and like having that experience of connecting with another and genuinely caring about, but also having a like a nurturing component. I think it was like Valens talks about the moon and Venus as being nurturing and the experience of what it's like to nurture something else. And that's a really unique experience that not everybody has or not everybody experiences the full range of it, but we all eventually experience some range of that. Even if we don't have children, it's like somebody might have like a house plant or something like that, and the experience of something that's completely dependent on you that you have to take care of, and the experience also of like if you neglect it, that thing can't take care of itself. I'm getting a lot of vibes like that here from this conjunction in Cancer, from this stellium of three planets in Cancer at the new moon, of the component of like nurturing and taking care of and actually genuinely caring for something else. And that being tied in with Saturn and the structuring of reality, and some sort of interchange between those two.
Yeah, one that's yeah, that's really good. And I would also add that with care, duty is often not far behind, right? If you have a pet,
Mm,
it might be your joy to care for them most of the time, but you also have a duty to feed them every day, right? It's not just when you're moved. And
right.
like obviously with human children as well. But yeah, the like care and duty are not the same thing, but there's an inherent there's an archetypal relationship between them.
Yeah. Well, it brings in, so it's like care, duty, compassion, nurturing, and things that come from the heart that arise from some of those feelings of like, because those are significations that Pisces and Cancer share in common to some extent as water signs, but both of them have that compassionate sense of like wanting to take care of people. It just tends to be either more narrowly focused in Cancer's case, where it's like focused on like the family or people in your immediate vicinity, whereas for Pisces it becomes more of this like universal care of like wanting to take care of everyone or like donate to a cause or like end homelessness or feed people at a food shelter or something like that. But here this month, we're seeing this nice alignment between both the localized sense of wanting to take care of people in your immediate family, as well as the broader sense of wanting to take care of the world, like, or the universe in general.
Yeah, it's really sweet.
Yeah, so I like that energy. I like that new moon. Of course, like lurking in the background is the Mars Uranus conjunction is about 6 degrees away at this point. So that's not like a huge signature quite yet for this new moon because it's not super close, but it's getting there, and that will end up being the next like major aspect that really starts forming after this new moon is complete.
Yeah. Yep. No, but it begins on a nice, it's nice. There's that little like mm, slightly awkward Mercury Pluto moment, but then it's Mercury Jupiter and this very sweet new moon on the degree of the rising of the theme mundi, which is Jupiter's exaltation degree, and Venus is there. Another thing I would add that's sort of happening from the beginning but continues all month is that Venus is slowly getting more and more distance from the sun.
Mm,
Um, to be able to arise in the sunset sky, or yeah, in the evening. And Venus is still close enough to the sun that you'll just get a glimpse under ideal conditions at the beginning of the month, but Venus gets more and more distance, and as Venus arises again, you really see you start to see and feel the changes that were made invisibly while Venus was conjoined the sun and hidden there. When Venus arises after a period of invisibility, you start to really see on the surface the deeper changes that occurred during the cazimi, which was beginning of June.
yeah, for sure. I'm looking at when Venus gets to that point. It looks like it's later in July when Venus fully comes out under the beams of the sun. But before we get there, that kind of brings us to our next transition point, which is
Yeah.
Venus's ingress into Leo on July 11th. So Venus departs from Cancer, and we sort of get rid of some of that nurturing energy, and instead we move into Leo. So this will be really interesting because this will take us back to last summer when we had that long Venus retrograde in Leo, that coincided with so many different events that were taking place last year. We had like the whole Barbie movie thing that happened when Venus stationed retrograde, and Oppenheimer. So we get a return to that, but the energy, the vibe is different this year. Not only because it's not a Venus retrograde, so it's not going to spend as much time in Leo. It's actually going to zoom through in a matter of weeks, but this year, because Pluto is now in Aquarius at the beginning of that sign, just like Mercury, we get this Venus Pluto opposition that takes place immediately upon that ingress on the 11th and 12th, which is a much different vibe and more challenging vibe for Venus moving into Leo at this time.
Yeah, there's it's almost like there's a little bit of an underworld flashback with Pluto there. And which in so with Mercury we have should we say like the dogged gumshoes pursuit of the truth and or paranoia, like suspicion with Mercury opposite Pluto. And with Venus, right, we have a similar, it's not quite paranoia with Venus, but the ease and joy, and sort of ease and easy expression that we would have. The fun in the sun, Venus and Leo vibe is, shadowed or undercut, or like there might be something to worry about, and maybe it's just worry that's something to worry about, but there's um that same sort of undercutting, suspicious, maybe things aren't okay energy for just a day or two before Venus moves on.
Yeah, well, it's like with Mercury, you get the intellectual paranoia, but with Venus, you get interpersonal paranoia. So it's like some of that gets turned inward towards relationships and relating, and those like questions that maybe somebody has of, is there something going on beneath the surface? Like, is a person being like honest, or is a person being faithful, or other
Mhm.
questions that sometimes arise with Venus Pluto when questions of either paranoia or power plays or control or manipulation come up in the sense of both relationships, both romantic relationships, but also sometimes one-on-one relationships or partnerships as well.
Yeah, right. Where and that like, oh my God, do they secretly hate me? I
Mm.
thought we were cool. Maybe there's something terribly wrong. Maybe this whole time, right? Like that relational paranoia, which again might be leading to a real thing. But also just might be a moment of insecurity. Um, yeah. But like, oh my God, do they secretly hate me? No,
Yeah.
but it felt like that for a second. Maybe they were having an off day and I interpreted it that way, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, and sometimes that thought pattern, once a person gets locked into it, can kind of like spiral into like a series of obsessive thoughts that can be hard to let go. So that's going to be most intense around the 11th and 12th. But luckily, after that, just like with Mercury, Venus starts heading into, I think, what's one of our most positive aspects of the month eventually later on, which is this sextile that's going to happen when Venus gets to 12 degrees of Leo around July 21st. So we don't have to talk about that super extensively because that ties us into our next lunation, which is that full moon, which we haven't gotten to yet. But this is my most positive and favorite aspect of the month is this Venus Jupiter sextile around the 21st when Venus at 12 Leo sextiles Jupiter at 12 Gemini. And what's interesting about that is I believe that's the degree that Venus retrograded back to last year at the very tail end of the Venus retrograde was about 12-ish degrees of Leo. So it almost like harkens back to that in some way from 1 year ago.
Yeah, that's really nice. I'm just glad Jupiter is there to lift Mercury and Venus, and then later the Sun out of the doldrums of the Pluto opposition so quickly.
For sure. Yeah. So it's like you get some of those paranoia or manipulation or other power play like Pluto feelings, but then there's almost like an assuagement of that that takes place eventually over the next couple of weeks. So that is going to take us into the very middle of the month, which brings us to our most dynamic and striking and potentially tense aspect of the month. But it's this Mars-Uranus conjunction that's going to take place, especially on July 14th and July 15th, where Mars conjoins the planet Uranus at 26 degrees of Taurus. Looks like 26 Taurus in around 18, 19 minutes. So,
Yeah,
um,
yeah. So like I guess let's break this down piece by piece. So first, right, it's a Mars Uranus conjunction, and it's also tightly conjoined the star Kaput Algol, which is has a fearsome and well-earned reputation as being the most malefic of the bright fixed stars. So just Mars Uranus is in and of itself quite volatile, right? What Mars and Uranus both share is a desire for things to change very quickly. And while Mars likes going fast, Uranus likes things to be sudden, shocking, too quick, like in the blink of an eye. Uranus is about like the moment of volatilization or ignition. And so when the two are combined, we almost always see accidents. You like accidents big enough to make the news of, a factory blows up, a chemical plant has a leak, and then, there's an explosion. We had like it's too volatile. And so that is, we almost always have issues there. On a personal level, it is potentially a trigger for people freaking the fuck out, right? Where we go from activated to completely to completely on fire, or someone explodes as a reaction to something, right? It's the parallel is that extremely quick chemical reaction. um it's when it's applied to human affairs, we often get or larger scale, we get violence. Violence is not uncommon. There's the accident side, but there's also the intention being associated strongly with whatever is cutting edge technologically. Mars Uranus has in the deployment of cutting edge weapons. One example being the pair of nuclear weapons that were used at the end of World War II. Both of those were deployed under Mars-Uranus conjunctions. And it's, of course, worth noting that the United States, which has for a long time now been a leader in cutting edge weapons, has Mars and Uranus together in the natal chart. And so it's a volatile thing in and of itself. And then being conjunct could put Algol, which is in the sort of Eastern Mediterranean Greek corpus, seen as the head of Medusa, is also seen in Chinese star lore as the anchor star for the mansion of the trenches of corpses, and the ghoul in Al-Ghul, Ras Al-Ghul. We still use the Arabic name for the star. The ghoul is the same ghoul for which like undead corpse-eating monsters in fantasy are named, right? It's the name of a corpse-eating spirit, right? Like an evil daimon or jinn. And when we look at when Kaput Algol shows up historically, we see incredibly fucked up, atrocious events. We see the bombing of Guernica, for example, massive civilian casualties. And so having the Mars Uranus on top of Algol, it sucks. It's probably going to be totally fine for individuals who are listening to this podcast, but it almost certainly denotes some atrocious event happening likely in one of the active theaters of conflict right now. And I hope I am completely wrong about that, but it hits natal charts of countries, and yeah, it's real. I'm not. I wouldn't be worried about it on an individual level, but as far as what will be happening in the world, I will be surprised and relieved if there isn't, if there aren't notable atrocities during this period of time.
Yeah, well, that, my friend, is not a rosy picture. I think I'm trying to think of anything that you didn't say. So yeah, like sudden changes, unexpected events, and upheavals. Rebelliousness is a major one with a strong urge to break free from restrictions and challenge the status quo. Impulsiveness, there's a common theme of people acting impulsively, taking risks before fully considering the
Mhm.
consequences. Unpredictability, especially unpredictable behavior, and a tendency to act on a whim, which then ties in with sometimes there can be accidents, where the impulsive and unpredictable nature can lead to accidents or injuries. There's also a strong drive for freedom with both planets. So this can inspire feelings of like independence or strong urge for individual freedom. Sometimes this can be, we've seen in the past can not be good when you combine all those things together. Like, for example, January 6th, when all those people like took over the Capitol, was the day that Mars ingressed into Taurus and began a sign-based conjunction with Uranus. So that's kind of like a reference point that we've had over the past several years in terms of what that can look like in very stark ways. On the positive side, sometimes there can be this feeling of like excitement and adventure and like going out and doing something new, striking out on a new path suddenly and unexpectedly, doing something that's way different than what you've done up to that point. There can also be this feeling of like innovation, like innovative ideas and a drive to create something new and groundbreaking, especially because it's Mars from a mechanical or technical perspective, is very common with both Mars as well as Uranus. So I'm trying to think of some like, because there will be some very challenging things, and that's going to be a very volatile and explosive energy that's going to manifest in some probably notably negative ways, but there's also going to be some constructive instances, especially if it's forming like nice trines or
Mhm.
sextiles to planets in somebody's chart, in which case some of that energy could be channeled in more constructive directions.
Yeah, yeah. If your chart is in such a position that you're going to need to do something with that. I think Mars Uranus is really excellent for, um, how do I put this? Fuck it, I'm going to do it myself and I'll do it my way.
Mm.
Like a lot of the a number of the negative potentials there are eliminated if it's just you struggling to do something yourself. Like I'm I'm not going to I'm not going to try to work within an existing organization or order um and try to get everybody to agree that my radical way of doing things is like just doing it yourself, just going off on your own, doing it your way, removing that social element, takes a lot of the stress out of Mars Uranus, because Mars Uranus are both antisocial to a meaningfully intense degree. And so removing the need to collaborate around whatever that is can be really helpful. Even if that's like going off for a few days and doing some work yourself and then coming back to whatever collaborative or institutional context you're in, but not trying to fight to do, like not getting caught in a fight around Mars year around that stuff, I think is a good way to give that fiercely independent energy a good place to go.
Yeah, for sure. I'm trying to think of like people because there's positive and negative examples of that. There's like the US is obviously like the classic countrywide example of that, where both many of the good things I think associated with the unit with the US in terms of positive manifestations of independence or technological innovations or things like that come from that conjunction in the US Sibley chart, but then also some of the negative things or the downsides with that, like the gun culture or refusal to have restrictions even on basic things like that also come like from that, because there can be this explosive sort of independence or this very stubborn independence to Mars Uranus conjunctions.
Yeah, fierce individualism, right?
Yeah,
Oh, and there's also a like, fuck it, we're moving to America, right? Like this, sure, we've been here for 100 generations, but it's a fucking mess. Fuck it, we're going to America is a very Mars Uranus thing.
totally, totally. And then, with accidents, a famous one of that, of course, is like Frida Kahlo and her Mars Uranus opposition. And she had that freak accident with that bus one day where she was riding on a bus and like crashed, and then she had a major injury. And that's often pointed to by the astrologers to her Mars Uranus contacts and her chart that were getting activated at the time. But then also there can sometimes be other types of Mars Uranus conjunctions that are kind of like quirky or kind of wacky. Robin Williams is like a good example of that. He had Mars Uranus conjunction. It was very close in Cancer, and his kind of like wacky, zany, impulsive, like comedic style that was also very improvisational. I'm not pronouncing that right, but the ability to improv well, I think, is a very Mars Uranus thing.
Right. The spontaneity is very Uranian. And Mars is good in the pocket, right? Mars is good at decision making, like in the middle of an ongoing thing. And yeah, Mars Uranus certainly has potential dangers, but is not universally like this terrible terrible atrocity full combination. This particular one atop that star is a pretty nasty combination. But Mars, there's a lot you can do with Mars Uranus, and there are gifts there as well. Worth noting the charts that Mars Uranus algol hits. One, I would look at the royal family of England, because there's a ton of algal stuff to the British royals. And so I would be surprised if there wasn't some meaningful development on such a rare conjunction atop algol, considering how much algol stuff is in that family. It also hits the chart of the EU, the moon, in the chart of the EU, which is at 24 of Taurus, and it also hits the sun in Israel's chart. It connects to other national nativities, but those are the conjunctions that I'm aware of.
Yeah, and that week, the Republican National Convention is actually taking place July 15th through the 18th. So, um,
Madness. They do
yeah,
not
so it's
have an. I know you were, there was a like, oh, is there a possibility that Trump has an astrologer and that's why the debate
right.
is where it is. The Republican National Convention does not have an astrologer. That is I would not schedule my event for then.
Yeah, so that's one check mark. We've got one for and one against, but yeah, so there may be some unexpected developments of that. Of course, just a few days earlier on the 11th, he's going to be sentenced when Mars is like right on his midheaven. So there could be some explosive stuff with respect to him that week that will
Yeah.
be following.
Yeah, almost certainly. And I would just I would add that my in that you have an election for the month, my anti-election, excuse me, for the month, sorry, is July 16th when the moon in Scorpio precisely opposes Mars and Uranus. It's
Yeah,
just a little bit past their conjunction, but it's the moon lighting them both up. So
that's
don't yeah, go ahead.
That's for sure the trigger, because that's what we've been seeing month after month, that some of these alignments happen, like with the Gemini stuff, all those planets moving into Gemini, but then it's really when the moon swoops in and triggers things, we keep seeing like the actual most important events taking place at that time. And even though that is, a day or two after the exact conjunction, that does seem like it will be a trigger here when the moon moves through the later part of Scorpio and opposes the Mars Uranus conjunction.
Oh, and it's Tuesday, so it's the day of Mars too.
Nice, nice. Yeah, in terms of elections this month, it's kind of really tough because we were having to work around this Mars-Uranus conjunction, so we didn't actually have a lot of good options for that. Um, so I'm going to give this chart. We actually have a bunch of electional charts we're going to record tomorrow for the Electional Astrology podcast for patrons. But just to give people something without going into too much details about it, we've got two options here, but both of them are going to be on July 2nd, just in order to take advantage of the Moon Jupiter conjunction that's happening that day in Gemini. So one of the options is to set the chart for, let's say, about for July 2nd, and then set it for local time for, let's say, about like 1 o'clock, whatever your local time is, so that the ascendant is trining Jupiter over there in the ninth house. The moon is in Gemini, applying to a conjunction with Jupiter. The ruler of the ascendant is Venus, which is up there in Cancer in the 10th whole sign house, forming a trine with Saturn. So some of the earlier things we were talking about, those Cancer placements, and the flowing sort of nurturing energy between Cancer and Pisces is just fully accentuated in this chart, along with some of the career and creative sort of tendencies of those placements. The downside is just that you really bake that Mercury Pluto opposition into things here, which I'm not a big fan of, but you can't really get around. So, some of the issues of like communication when it comes to intense getting to the bottom of things, and the potential downside of like paranoia or power and control issues are a potential there. There's a variant time where you could also switch the chart and move it later in the day with Sagittarius rising, which is a possibility. So it would be something like 5:30 p.m. or so later the same day on July 2nd. Then you would get a chart with Sagittarius rising, Jupiter in the seventh whole sign house in a day chart, the moon still applying to a conjunction with Jupiter, which may be helpful in different time zones in order to make sure the moon is in Gemini. And yeah, that's basically the core of that chart. Basically, this is more oriented towards other people to some extent, but you're basically just trying to maximize the moon Jupiter conjunction that's taking place that day to whatever extent you can. So this is much different than the electional charts from the last couple of months, where we had those like amazing stellium elections that we were telling everybody to take advantage of while they could, because now we're moving into sort of more challenging electional territory with some of the aspects that are happening this summer and later this year. But this is one example of a chart you could use in order to do something. And then Lisa Scheim and I will be outlining some other electional charts that will take place at different points in July on the Electional Astrology Podcast, which we're going to release in the next couple of days through our page on Patreon. So you can sign up for more if you're looking for other dates during the course of July to do things. All right, so back to where we were with Mars Uranus. I think we've talked about that pretty extensively.
Yeah. I let,
So,
let me just add that I'm excited that Mars changes signs shortly thereafter. Less than a week after that conjunction, Mars leaves Taurus.
mm,
And as intense as a fixed star influence can be, it's always going to be short as long as the planet keeps moving. And Mars just, there's this very intense conjunction with Uranus right atop Algol, but then Mars just continues on. And although we have some moments of real friction later in August when Mars makes a tight square with Saturn. The first part of much of the first part of Mars's journey through Gemini has it moving into a conjunction with Jupiter, which is I should say much less explosive and evil omen than the Mars Uranus algol. So
yeah, I mean, it is less unexpected, less potential for explosive stuff in terms of unexpected things that just come out of left field. But that conjunction is not going to be super pretty because it's going to be squaring Saturn at the same time when it happens in the middle of August. It's like Mars catches up to Jupiter at 16 degrees of Gemini and then squares Saturn immediately after that at 17 degrees of Pisces. And what's funny about that is this is when the Democratic National Convention is going to take place, and we already know that that's going to be a complete. There's going to be some stuff going on there.
indeed. Well, and so yeah, so when Mars gets into mid Gemini, very different deal. But not nearly as intense. It'll be a lowering of intensity.
Right.
And like there'll be much less to manage for Mars for the rest of July. Once we get into second week of August, it's its own whole thing.
Yeah, totally.
So
So that.
one thing to
Oh,
note about that upcoming Mars Jupiter conjunction, it's in exactly the same degree as the Sun Venus conjunction was in Gemini. Both of them are at 16
oh,
Gemini.
oh, wow. That's great. So that's going to connect some events back to, I mean, some in some ways positive, but in some negative, something positive that happened at the beginning of June, but then there being something that's challenging that comes up in the middle of August.
Yeah. Well, and Mars Jupiter, yeah, right. Mars Jupiter with Saturn looking on. Can Mars Jupiter can be very heroic and overcoming, but it does mean that there's something that requires a heroic level of effort to overcome, right?
Mhm.
Like if we're bringing in the positive, it implies that there is a negative that one's heroism is required to deal with.
Yeah. So I want to redirect really quickly to our
Sure.
second lunation, and then we'll talk more about the Mars Gemini stuff. But
Yeah.
it's really set off by this second lunation, which is a full moon in the sign of Capricorn, which occurs early on July 21st. And this seems like actually the most notable lunation of the month because there's so many different aspects that are taking place at the same time. So the lunation itself, the full moon goes exact at 29 degrees of Capricorn. And so the moon at the time then will immediately move towards a sextile with Neptune at 29 Pisces and then immediately conjoin Pluto at 0 degrees of Aquarius. So that full moon's really emphasizing Pluto at 0 degrees of Aquarius. But then it's like Mars has just ingressed into Gemini. So this will be like the first full day of Mars in Gemini, and we'll start seeing some news stories that are going to give us a preview of what that is about. And we'll see the shift almost immediately in terms of the tonal change from Mars having spent a month or so in Taurus to the next month or so of Mars going through Gemini.
And
Um,
worth just real quick, Mars is in a perfect by degree antitial relationship to that to that full moon
okay,
or
that's
contra
interesting.
antitia, but like the Mars moon the Mars Moon relationship there is extremely strong.
Yeah, and even just, I mean, it's trining Pluto from 0 degrees of Gemini to 0 degrees of Pluto is one of the other really close aspects as well. So that's an exact aspect happening. The Venus Jupiter sextile is actually taking place the same day. So Venus at 12 degrees of Leo sextiling Jupiter, which is really positive. I don't want to say counterbalancing, but just there's something very nice happening at this lunation when we're having this culmination of events at the full moon that seems really tense with the conjunction of that with Pluto. But then it's like there's some positive things happening at the same time, which I'm happy about. But then there's also some like unexpected communication things with Mercury at 26 Leo squaring Uranus at 26 degrees of Taurus. So there's all sorts of just like exact aspects taking place at the same day on the day of a full moon. And I think this is going to be one of our more sort of memorable days of the month.
Yeah, there's a lot that's midstream. There's like negative stuff that's still ongoing or taking a turn. There's positive stuff that's been developing. There's surprising stuff. And it's the day before the sun's ingress into Leo and first ever opposition with Pluto in Aquarius.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So that'll be the very first beginning of Leo season that's opposed Pluto.
Yeah. It's very, yeah,
Nice.
very midstream, like a bunch of connected and disconnected threads, all at an interesting point at that full moon.
Yeah. And you had a interesting point about that in terms of what Leo seasons are like now, and this being the early preview of that or the first time we're going to experience that and how that's affecting things even just generationally.
Oh, yeah. Let me see if I can remember that and articulate it well.
Just like the
So
Pluto and Leos and how that's different for Pluto and Leos that are experiencing this Pluto opposition and other things like that.
yeah, so I mean, so this is, every time the sun goes through Leo for the next 20 years, it's going to be opposing Pluto and Aquarius. And so there it's not just the sun, but also, we have we have a very large generation of people, the Pluto and Leos born between what mid 40s and 1959, who all have Pluto and Leo, who are all going to be undergoing their Pluto oppositions. And then we also have a large number of countries that were created right after World War II and were created with Saturn conjunct Pluto in Leo in their natal charts. And so, we have a lot of kind of funky borders that one wonders whether they will stand the test of time. But it's dozens of countries, and all of them will be undergoing their Pluto opposition as well as Saturn being opposed. And so, Pluto in Aquarius has its own meaning and things that it's going to be bringing up, but it also, it also is going to be opposing all of this Pluto and Leo architecture, which, if you think of culture in the United States, so much of our culture was created and sort of defined and genreified by the Pluto and Leo generation, the AKA the boomers. And so, this is this slow, um, I don't know, like it'll be very interesting to see what survives this 20 years, and what fades away into history, both culturally and internationally, as Pluto opposes all the stuff that got built when Pluto is 180 degrees away.
Yeah. I was seeing some like organizational stuff of I've seen some attention that I noticed with some Pluto and Leos having created things earlier in their life and needing to hand it over to the next generation, but struggling to let go and to like just pass it on and trying to sometimes come back and like take over again, even though the moment has sort of passed and they need to like sort of like let go and let things go through those natural cycles. But having this, I think that's a very Plutonian impulse to try to just like latch on to something and to like not let go until the very end and to have a struggle to like let go of something. I think that's, makes a lot of sense in terms of Pluto, but I think that's something that some of the baby boomer generation, the Pluto and Leos are struggling with a little bit generationally.
Yeah, absolutely. And on a sort of including that, but maybe even wider level, celebrity culture is really a Pluto and Leo thing. Like I'm like I guess to a certain degree we have a little bit of that with movie stars in the 20s and 30s, but like, celebrity culture, which is such an important part of such an important feature of American culture, like that emerged makes sense, right? It's sort of a pseudo royalty. Instead of gossiping about the nobility, we have this, sort of actor celebrity class that gets gossiped about instead. Which, if I were the secret nobility, I would think that that was an excellent red herring or sort of shield, so people wouldn't gossip about me. I think royal aristocrats from history would probably be quite jealous that the Americans invented a distraction that big so people wouldn't get into their business. But
Mm.
anyway, just the point about like maybe America gets tired of celebrity culture over the next 20 years. Or
I mean, we'll see. I mean, Sarah in the live chat in the audience with patrons points out maybe it's even more so in the fixed signs in terms of that impulse to not let go. And I think that's a really good point because I'm seeing a similar thing with millennials. It's really interesting seeing the Pluto and Scorpio millennial generation on Reddit struggling with they're getting old basically. Like they're hitting their 40s at this point, and there's like like there's a subreddit called Millennials on Reddit, and it's been interesting seeing that generation who was one of the main demographic of Redditors, go from like 10 years ago being in their early 30s, coming out of their 20s to now. And it's interesting seeing their reflections about this generational shift or some of the different generational things they're running into. So it's like the other side of the coin.
mm-hmm.
It's the square, the Pluto square, as opposed to the generational turning point that Pluto and Leos are reaching in terms of the opposition.
Yeah, like, oh God, we're the adults now.
Right. We're the adults, but we don't feel like adults. We still feel like we're in our 20s. How do we cope with that? Or having generational shifts where even simple things like all of a sudden like skinny jeans are now going out again. And I think like apparently baggy jeans are coming back in. So it's funny, seeing we've seen a full shift from like 90s baggy jeans were in and then it shifted at one point and it was like skinny jeans were in and now it's going back out again. So living on a long enough timeline to see multiple generational or even style shifts take place over the course of your life and having the perspective that that gives you is a really weird experience, I think, as a human. And it's something you can't fully understand until you experience it yourself.
Yeah. What about milk stained sweatpants? So that's kind of what I've been rocking. Is that
That
coming
is
in?
that is timeless. That will never go out of style. Um, Yeah, somebody was talking about doing like a get ready for me video. There's like these influencers that do a video where they like put on makeup or something for like TikTok and they talk about their thoughts as they're doing it. And I was thinking about doing a get ready with me, but unfortunately I realized like that would just be me putting on a black shirt and that's pretty much all I do and it's over. So it'd be a very short video. So I'm gonna have to brainstorm something else.
Yeah, some real behind the scenes shit.
Exactly. All right. So where are we at? We're at that second lunation. The Mars Uranus is finally separating. And once that shift takes place, if it moves into Gemini, there will be that shift. So we're getting fully out of that Mars Uranus territory and the volatility of it. But then, as you said, it's like we start building up to, on the one hand, we get to Mars and Gemini and just experiencing that as an archetype, which is a much more volatile communication type energy, where communications start becoming more direct, more quick. And one of the things that goes along with that is we start heading into a Mercury retrograde, and especially when Mercury changes signs and moves into Virgo on the 25th and 26th, um, look how close Mercury is to squaring Mars at that point. It's only like 3 degrees from squaring Mars at 3 degrees of Gemini. So I feel like the later part of the month, the end of July, we have some communication volatility in terms of like that can be like arguments, it can be because it's also about to be a Mercury retrograde, because Mercury will station retrograde in Virgo in early August. It could be like miscommunications or misunderstandings that lead to a conflict or an argument or a falling out. It can be a sharp exchange of words between two people, and different things like that.
Yeah, yeah, the Mars being there and the Mercury's configuration to it definitely gives like swift, smart, clever, cruel tone to communications. But it's interesting because the that Mercury retrograde looms at the end towards the was it it's August 5th, right? So it's beyond the boundary of the month, but it's getting set up. But then we have Mars and the Sun are both moving into configuration with that Jupiter, which is kind of chilling things out and literally a benefic in a Mercury ruled sign. And so, there's some, how do I put this? There's a little bit of give, a little bit of space, a little bit of padding at the same time as there's some sharpness. And later, the mercurial wavelength will be much more troubled. When Mercury is retrograde and Mars, we've got Mars Saturn rather than Mars, where the Mars Saturn is dominating the Mars Jupiter. But it's sort of it it feels workable towards the end of July. It's just not a permanent state of affairs.
Yeah. So this, one of the signatures of this summer for me is this Jupiter Saturn square, which by the end of July is coming into full effect because by July 31st, Jupiter's at 14 degrees of Gemini and Saturn's at 18 degrees of Pisces. And Saturn's actually retrograde, so it's moving earlier. So they're actually moving together at this point. So there's some sort of tension here between the spirit of expansion that's in Jupiter and Gemini versus the feeling of like contraction that's happening over there with Saturn and Pisces. One of the things more broadly from just even an economic standpoint that makes me nervous is just as Jupiter moves further and further into Gemini, it's not just going to square Saturn, but also eventually will start squaring Neptune. And we know the last time that Jupiter made a hard aspect with Neptune, we had all those issues with inflation. So I'm a little nervous about what that indicates in terms of potential turbulence for the economy with Jupiter squaring Saturn and Neptune, just because that strikes me as both um, a contraction type energy, having Saturn in the dominant position over Jupiter and like trying to rein it in, but then also Jupiter squaring Neptune and having this sort of ambiguousness surrounding boundaries and things that are getting too large, things that are like ballooning up, and attempts to put a cap on that, sometimes struggling or not being able to maintain things. And if that wasn't enough, it's like Mars moves into alignment with that at the same time, which just will accelerate all of that much further.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's a lot there.
Yeah. So that becomes some of the energy that we're left with. We're left on a little bit of a cliffhanger at the end of July just because the Mars Jupiter conjunction is really building up into full prominence at that point, with Mars at 7 degrees of Gemini and Jupiter at 14 Gemini and Saturn at 18 Pisces. So by the time we check in again next month, we're going to be right on the cusp of that Mars Jupiter energy, which also
And
can have.
yeah, well, and also at the cusp of Mercury stationing retrograde, and that Mars Jupiter is in a Mercury ruled sign, right? Like
Right.
towards the end of July, getting some of the more positive Mars Jupiter stuff, but then they're both getting closer to Saturn, and the ruler is about to station retrograde, and so it's gonna go a different direction in August.
Yeah, for sure. And even like Mars Jupiter can have an explosive energy in and of itself sometimes. Like we saw, what was that, like a few years ago, there was some Mars Jupiter alignment that coincided with like the explosion in Beirut somewhere, I think. So we will have to check in again because by the time we check in and do our next forecast, Mars will have been in Gemini for a while and we'll have a better sense of that energy, and some of the trends that will culminate at the exact conjunction will already be building up and starting to crest at that point. But it leaves us on a little bit of an interesting transitional cliffhanger here at the end of
Yeah.
July.
Yeah, the next thing is like building up and not quite apparent yet as July ends.
Mm, right. Yeah. So that is kind of unfortunately where we leave off here is on that cliffhanger and that transition. So just to summarize, it's like the very beginning of July is really dominated by the Saturn Neptune energy, and that's going to continue to be prominent for the first week or so. Then in the middle of the month, the Mars Uranus conjunction really culminates. So we have that volatile, unexpected, sort of explosive energy right in the middle of July. Then finally, later in the month, we get this shift of Mars going into Gemini and Mercury squaring Mars so that we have more of a, miscommunications in the build up to Mercury retrograde and things going a little haywire in terms of technology or stuff like that, but also having verbal conflicts and like arguments over that. So there's more of a explosive intellectual or verbal energy in terms of exchanges that start happening by late July.
Yeah, it's starting to get a little argumentative. Um,
That's a good word.
yeah, contentious.
Contentious, that's a great word.
And because now I'm a super softie, I will point out that there are a number of really nice Mercury and Venus moments throughout July, especially the, first two thirds. Like we get the sextile with Mercury and Jupiter and the sextile with Venus and Jupiter, and it's Venus coming back into visibility, starting to rise in the evenings. It's not entirely bereft of fun in the sun. There's some nice moments, and they probably won't be entered into the annals of history. But as far as the lived experience of July, they're nice. There are some nice moments as well as some intense things.
Yeah, for sure. We've pointed out that new moon that looks pretty chill around the 5th and 6th, and the Mercury Jupiter sextile you just mentioned is taking place around the 7th and 8th, especially. Actually, it looks like it's exact on the 8th. Um, and then even the Venus Jupiter sextile, even though it's happening on the same day as this kind of not chaotic, but there's so much going on. So there's a very active full moon that takes place on the 21st, but there should be one aspect of that for some people is going to be some very positive things with Venus sextiling Jupiter on the same day. And I think that may connect for some people, connect things back to events that took place a year ago when Venus stationed direct at the same degree after at the end of the Venus retrograde. So it'll probably be a nice reminder of that for certain people that should be positive, especially if you have something around 12 degrees of the fixed signs.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's a mixed bag. There's some treats in there. There are also some rusty nail. you know, Take a look to, when you root around in the bag and grab for something, look at what you're grabbing, because there are configurations of very different varieties in July, on offer in July.
Yeah, and some people are going to be able to ride that impulsive feeling or even the volatility feeling of even the Mars conjunction in the middle of the month constructively, and others are going to be caught off guard with it or maybe do something rash and impulsive that doesn't have a great outcome. But I think that'll be somewhat clear just based on how it's hitting your chart. If it's hitting your chart as a hard aspect, you might want to exercise more caution,
Mhm.
especially if you feel yourself being driven to do something impulsively or even in anger that it may have an unexpected outcome versus if that's hitting your chart in a more flowing way, you may just feel a sudden explosion of having the desire to break free from things, to exercise your freedom and to do something new or innovative that you haven't done before. And that energy could actually be very positive.
Yeah, do something fiercely original and innovative.
Brilliant. Good keywords. All right, my friend. I think that brings us to the end of this podcast. So we did pretty good. We kept it down a little shorter than usual.
Yeah,
But yeah, uh,
progress.
we're making progress. We got it like 15 minutes shorter than usual. I think that's good. So, what do you have going on this month, or what are you working on?
So I'm back to work on 36 Faces. This will probably be my last death march towards completion. That's exciting. Probably gonna get started officially on that nice looking new moon. I one of the one of the Sphere and Sundry series that we did while Mars was in Capricorn. It's a second decan of Capricorn series. And what's nice about the second decan of Capricorn is, though it's martial, the Mars is tasked with building, constructing, and the sort of ferocity of ambition to build something, to construct something, a great pyramid, a cathedral, a worthy edifice. And so we thought that would be a nice thing to release, as something that's martial, but pushing the Mars in a useful direction, in a literally constructive direction rather than a destructive direction. So we made a bunch of stuff, a bunch of different series then, and so I'm excited to see that come out. I think this will be the first official Decan series that Sphere and Sentry's put out. There's been some Decan that's gone into some of the elections, but this is explicitly a decanic series. So I'm going to be working. I will be doing a limited enrollment for the year one of my program in the middle of September. So just mention that now if you want to get on the list, sign up for the mailing list. But that's, a couple months out. Other than that, I'm just going to be teaching classes and finishing faces.
Awesome. Brilliant. What are your websites?
So it's austincoppock.com and sphereandsundry.com.
Cool. And I'll put links to those to your website in the description below this episode on YouTube or on the podcast website for this episode. As for myself, I had a bunch of new people start the Hellenistic course over the past month, and I'm getting ready to do a live webinar. We're going to talk about planetary condition and the conditions of bonification and maltreatment, which is how to determine if a planet is really well placed in a chart or really poorly placed. And people are going to share their stories and examples of having those conditions in their chart, and looking at what you and I were talking about earlier, Austin, which is, what does it mean sometimes when a planet's either really well placed or poorly placed, or what happens when a planet has both, where sometimes you have like a really difficult aspect, but a positive aspect at the same time, and how does that actually work out in practice? So I'm going to be interviewing different students who have those placements, and we're going to be coming to deeper understandings about what that means through that live format, which I'm really excited about. So people can get access to that webinar or the recording, which I'll post afterwards on the Hellenistic astrology course that is available at theastrologyschool.com. And other than that, I'm also working on releasing an ebook version, finally a PDF of my Hellenistic astrology book. And I'm actually going to record a little like tour of the book to talk about the book and reflect on the book and talk about how I wrote it and some of the different things people can find in it, which I think I'm going to add as a little bonus download that will be included in the PDF ebook version. So I'm just working on that right now, and I'll have an announcement at some point this month once it's ready and available for purchase.
Nice, like an audio forward.
Yeah, exactly. Especially nice now that it's been out for a few years, and I can talk a little bit about the impact and some of the things that went into writing it. I want to talk about the behind the scenes stuff a little bit, about how I went to a coffee shop each day and just like worked on the book, as well as what the broader 10-year period was, because I wrote that book for 10 years before it finally came out. I'm even going to show some early examples of the cover of the book, which I had conceived of the cover at the very beginning of the 10-year project, and then you can see how it actually came out in the final version in comparison. So it'll be a lot of fun, and yeah, I'm excited to do that. So you can find out more information about that. I don't know, I'll announce it on like Twitter or something like that. So just pay attention to those, and I'll also announce it on the podcast once it's out. So I think that's it for this episode, though, of the Astrology Podcast. Thanks a lot for joining me today, Austin. Your glasses are really glowing and growing on me. So yeah,
Yeah, this is super soft glasses dad, Austin.
right.
That's
You're working into your
the new
dad phase.
edition.
Totally. Cool. All right. Well, thanks everyone for watching or listening to this episode of the Astrology Podcast, and I'll see you again next time.
All right, take care, everyone.
If you appreciate the work I'm doing here on the podcast and you'd like to find a way to support it, then consider becoming a patron through my page on patreon.com. In exchange, you'll get access to some great subscriber benefits, including early access to new episodes, the ability to attend the live recording of the forecast each month, our monthly Auspicious Elections podcast, which is only available to patrons, a whole exclusive podcast series called the Casual Astrology Podcast, or you can even get your name listed in the credits. You can find out more information at patreon.com/astrologypodcast. Special thanks to all the patrons that helped to support the production of this episode of the podcast through our page on patreon.com. In particular, shout out to the patrons on our producers tier, including Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Issa Sabah, Jake Otero, Jeannie Marie Kaplan, Melissa Delano, Sunny Bozbaz, and Kwatsi Ali Barohu. If you're looking for a reliable astrologer to get an astrological consultation with, then we have a new list of astrologers on the podcast website that we recommend for readings. Most of the astrologers specialize in birth chart readings, although some also offer synastry, rectification, electional astrology, horary questions, and more. Find out more information at theastrologypodcast.com/consultations. The astrology software that we use and recommend here on the podcast is called SolarFire for Windows, which is available for the PC at alabe.com. Use the promo code AP15 to get a 15% discount. For Mac users, we recommend a software program called AstroGold for Mac OS, which is from the creators of SolarFire for PC, and it includes both modern and traditional techniques. You can find out more information at astrogold.io, and you can use the promo code AstroPodcast15 to get a 15% discount. If you'd like to learn more about my approach to astrology, then I'd recommend checking out my book titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune, where I go over the history, philosophy, and techniques of ancient astrology, taking people from beginner up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. If you're really looking to expand your studies of astrology, then I would recommend my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is an online course on ancient astrology where I take people through basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures as well as guided readings of ancient texts, and by the time you finish the course, you will have a strong foundation in how to read birth charts as well as make predictions. You can find out more information at courses.theastrologyschool.com. And finally, thanks to our sponsors, including the Mountain Astrologer magazine, which is a quarterly astrology magazine which you can read in print or online at mountainastrologer.com.